Justin Sonnenberg 是史丹佛大学免疫学及微生物学教授，也是我们敬爱的 Huberman 教授的同事。但这都不是重点啦。其实我做这一集的初衷是想解救台湾万千同胞于水深火热的益生菌割韭菜大镰刀之下。当然，益生菌到底有没有效，确实还是有值得讨论的空间。我个人认为，不能说是完全鬼扯吧，至少也是毫无效果。不过，在史丹佛医学院的网志 Scope 上，有一期文章 Do Probiotics Live Up to the Hype Part 2， 最后的一段总结很有意思。这篇文章自问自答的说，那今天参与讨论的专家到底有没有吃益生菌呢？ No。 这些专家也包括今天的主角 Justin Sonnenberg， 他与 Huberman 博士分享在顶级科学期刊 Cell 上刊载的一系列实验，告诉大家怎样的饮食才能真正促进肠胃健康，增强免疫力。Life Kaizen 将为大家把英语圈的生活改善新知，定期以超浓缩加划重点的形式制作成影片，供各位朋友参考及分享。您的支持是我持续做这个节目的动力。喜欢的话，请务必订阅、点赞、按小铃铛哦。
We wanted to understand if we put people on a high fiber diet, how would that affect their microbiome and immune system? And if we put them on a high fermented food diet, a diet rich in live microbes and all the metabolites that are present from fermentation in foods, how would that change microbiome and immune system?
Could you give us some examples of what those diets look like? And were you changing their basal diet, or were you just adding things on top of what they were already eating?
When you start doing food studies, you can't do a placebo group because people know what they're eating. And the other problem is that it's really hard to just change one thing, because as soon as you start adding something, people usually eliminate something else. So the idea was to basically give these people simple instructions. In the case of the high fiber diet, just increasing plant-based fiber. So can you eat more whole grains, more legumes, more vegetables, nuts, get the fiber up in the range of, from 15 to 20 grams per day up to over 40 grams per day. So can you kind of double or more the amount of fiber that you eat per day, knowing that that would have a tremendous impact on a lot of other facets of their diet. They eat less meat, animal-based protein, less animal-based fats as a product of this. A lot of the macronutrient changes that we saw in their diet were consistent with healthy changes in diet, less saturated fat, less animal-based protein, more plant-based protein. So a lot of changes that are known to be beneficial kind of came in concert with just telling people eat a high fiber diet, high plant-based fiber diet. People that were eating the high fermented food, they were instructed to basically eat foods that you could buy at a grocery store that were naturally fermented and contain live microbes. And so this, largely consisted of yogurt, kefir, sauerkraut, kimchi, some fermented vegetables, kind of brined fermented vegetables. Pickles, things like that. But they do, one of the things that I think is a pitfall in choosing fermented foods is, you can go down the canned food aisle and there's this huge section of pickles and jars that are canned. Those are not fermented foods. Those are cucumbers that they've put in acetic acid and vinegar to reconstitute that fermented flavor, but there's no live microbes involved in that. And even sauerkrauts in the canned food aisle, even if they were naturally fermented, quite often they're not. Quite often they're just brined in vinegar. But even if they are naturally fermented, all of the microbes are killed prior to canning or during the process of canning. And so so what we use for this study, and if you want to have live fermented foods that contain live microbes, you need to buy those out of a refrigerated section, essentially.
And I'm really glad you pointed this out because you can find sauerkraut on the non-refrigerated shelf. A lot of fermented foods that are available in the U.S. can be high in sugar. Was there any instruction as to, getting people to make sure that they were consuming yogurts that weren't loaded with sugar?
Yep, it's a super important point. We instructed people to eat non-sweetened yogurts. Right. A huge pitfall in this area is you can have a yogurt loaded with bacteria, kind of the base of what's healthy, and then a ton of artificial flavoring and sugar loaded on top of that. Manufacturers put a ton of sugar in after the fact to kind of mask the sour taste of fermented foods, which is hard for some people to become accustomed to. Getting used to that sour flavor is difficult, but people really should try to stay away from those fermented foods that are loaded with sugar, and that's what we instructed people in this study.
And beer was not included. Beer is fermented, correct? But were they instructed to avoid beer or to drink beer?
Just to go with their normal dietary habits, but that did not count as a fermented food. And
but kombucha was, as I recall.
Kombucha was,
right? Yeah.
and kombucha can have small amounts of alcohol in it. You know, the deal with beer is that there may be beneficial properties of the microbial communities in naturally fermented beer, but most of the beer that we buy, again, is canned and filtered, and there's no live microbes there. So very different than if you siphon it off of your home brew and drink it, probably, than if you buy it in a store.
So how much fermented food, and then were they consuming?
The general instructions were for people to eat as much fermented foods as possible. More is better. The reason is that with this initial study, we really wanted to maximize our chance of seeing a signal if there was something biological going on, with the idea that if the dose was excessive and not easily achievable by a lot of people in the end, we can go back and say, okay, this is the point at which we lose the biological signal. But people during the height of the intervention phase was 6 weeks, were up over 6 servings on average per day of fermented foods. So kind of 2 servings at each meal. Ounces or weight or size, it really depended on what the fermented food was. And we just told them to stick to what was a recommended dose on the package they were buying.
So what were the results?
The results were astounding because our hypothesis going into this was that the high fiber diet was going to give the massive signal. We know that this is the big deficiency in the Western diet. And it turns out that high fermented food arm, that really gave us the big signal, even though our hypothesis was that the high fiber was going to lead to more short chain fatty acids produced in the gut, more diverse microbiota, less inflammation in the immune system. We didn't see that across the cohort. We actually saw very individualized responses to the dietary fiber. The big signal really was in the fermented food group. We saw this increase in microbiota diversity over the course of the 6 weeks while they were consuming the fermented foods. We can't always say that higher diversity is better when it comes to our microbial communities. We know there are cases, for instance, bacterial vaginosis, where higher diversity is actually indicative of a disease state. But we know in the context of the gut and for people living in the industrialized world, higher diversity is generally better. We know that there's a spectrum of diversity. People with higher diversity generally are healthier. If you can push your diversity higher, you're in better shape. And then the major question is what happened to the immune system as these people were increasing their gut microbiota diversity through the fermented foods. So we did this massive immune profiling, and we see a couple dozen immune markers, inflammatory markers, decrease over the course of the study. We measure these at multiple time points throughout the course of the study, and there's kind of this stepwise reduction in things like interleukin-6 and interleukin-12, a variety of kind of famous inflammatory mediators. And then even if you go into the immune cells, we see that those signaling cascades are less activated at the end of the study compared to the beginning of the study, indicating an attenuation of inflammation. So kind of exactly what we would hypothesize would lead to less propensity for inflammatory disease over time.